what will the contribution of a scholar, of a conscious scholar, with regard to pandemic?
Scholars Unbound is a bi-monthly podcast or video series that showcases the voices of scholars who know no boundaries when it comes to the pursuit of knowledge. You will hear insights from their experiences as international scholars and how these influence their research, hoping to inspire future scholars to be fearless, global, and unbound. I'm your host, Dalia Simangan. Hi, everyone. I'm very happy that you're joining us in this episode of the Scholars Unbound podcast video series because today I'm joined by Irine Hiraswari Gayatri. Irene is a PhD candidate at the Gender, Peace, and Security Center at Monash University. She's also a senior researcher at the Center for Political Studies, Indonesian Institute of Sciences. Irene is actively engaged with policy action, having been involved with UN Women and the UN Office on Drugs and Crime in Bangkok, Thailand, and the National Counterterrorism in Indonesia, among many other affiliations. She contributes her research not just to academic networks, but also to policy making. And I will link in the show notes her work published in Jakarta Post, Lowy Interpreter, and other platforms. Irene, thank you so much for accepting my invitation and welcome to the show.
Thank you, Dalia. It's good to see you, and I'm very appreciate that you invite me to this session.
So great to connect with you and talk to you about your doctoral research. So could you tell us about your doctoral research and why did you also decide to do your research at Monash University?
My topic is actually regarding the approaches to violent extremism in the implementation of women, peace, and security agenda in Indonesia. Why I choose that topic? No other than because I was quite involved in the adoption of these international norms in Indonesia back then. And this topic is particularly of my interest since it combined women not only as a part of, sometimes in Asian culture, we think women as only, the side actor, right? But with this instrument, I think we departed from the post 1998 conflict situation and peace building in Indonesia, where women were sidelined from many fronts, especially formal peace building. And that made me curious on whether there is a possibility that women could be also an active part of the peace building. But theoretically, what I'm looking is how norm cycle theory and localization theory applies to the role of women agency in terms of the formulation of women peace and security agenda and the prevention of violent extremism.
Thank you for your research, Irene. And I reached out to you and requested you to join us in this episode after reading your Twitter post on the sense or the feeling of loss and grief among international students and why we need to pay particular attention to how international students experience this, maybe disproportionately because of the impact of the pandemic. So could you share with us the unique challenges international students face during this COVID-19 pandemic? I know this is quite personal and maybe difficult, but please have the freedom to share whatever you feel is comfortable with you.
Yeah, as you mentioned, definitely pandemic has affected many, perhaps thousands of us scholars. I also always there's this feeling. Well, in Australia, Indonesia is only by flight. Usually, Melbourne, Jakarta is only 7 hours, right? So when the pandemic started to close our border in March 2020, I didn't have that, shocked feeling. I just okay, I cannot go to Jakarta. My family cannot go here. My son and I have to, under the first toughest lockdown in Melbourne we experienced, 8 months, if I not mistaken. And then we had to everything work from home. We adjusted ourselves with school from home. So I divided my working space in my shared house with my son. I haven't moved to my house, the current house, but the first I moved with several other friends. So imagine the privacy we had. We had to really share and tolerant with, other member of our house, because we are also, international student solidarity in the face of pandemic. So that is the first keyword, I think, as international students in Australia during pandemic. My first impression was that it was easy to, show solidarity because we are in this moment together. Of course, there is a different. My reaction to pandemic is not the same as my colleagues' response to pandemic, right? Uh, as a mother of one, I always realize in the back of my head that I cannot be too sad about what happened. Of course, that also depends on, how you see how you see the effect of the pandemic to your work or to yourself. So in July, I think it was true. In July 2020, 3 months after lockdown, I managed to have my confirmation panel, and it was satisfactory. I was, happy, of course, because first year of my work as PhD candidate, do, and it went well. But the pandemic is not weakened my capacity to write. So since June 2019, actually, when I stepped my foot to the university, I've already started to write a blog several times. During pandemic, I could produce one blog a month. Those writings were, sometimes if I sit down for a while every day, 1 or 2 hours, just thinking what happened in the world, what happened in Indonesia, what happened with the theoretical discussion, how can I go beyond? So these are routine thinking that I do every day. So instead of 24/7 being said, you cannot do anything, uselessness, helplessness, I experienced those. And I think the second year of pandemic hit me pretty much because I lost 6 friends. And I also have to pay more attention to what happens surrounding my nuclear family back home and my spouse's family as well. So every day I WhatsApp them asking how they are doing. But I think that sort of communication also helped me in terms of survival. But I think one challenge for me is how to grieve without continuously eating up your energy. How to grieve healthily. Oh my God. That is, without practicing it, it's just nonsense. Sometimes, because I know there is a variety of limitation for everyone in the face of grievance, right? We saw it in conflict situation, and I see it, experience it under pandemic as well. So my former research is actually studying, part of my former research was actually how to recognize the effect of conflict if you are going to put yourself in terms of peace building. So if in retrospect, during pandemic, how you recognize your response toward the worst effect of pandemic, but try to mitigate around it and survive. So that is like, everyday question. If McGinty said everyday peace building, this is everyday peace building for myself as well. How to find a very practical way to heal from PTSD because of the frequent news of death. Actually, into 2020, I didn't imagine I could think like this, because probably the level of, the mortality rate was not that high. But today, this morning, I read that Indonesia has surpassed India in terms of COVID victims. And that is huge. It's just like, oh my God, it's like a punch on your heart. I also think that I can survive it because I realize how privileged I am as a student, international student, sheltered in Australia's tough lockdown system. But also I realize in Australian society, there are still pros and cons toward how the government treat the lockdowns. Some people struggle to get vaccinated, while I already get 2 doses of Pfizer's. So this kind of fortunate, unfortunate, I always realize that in the back of my head. That actually made me wise in terms of posting anything in social media. I think if you ask, what will the contribution of a scholar, of a conscious scholar with regard to pandemic, is that you can, measure how you will respond in social media. Because you realize everyone bear the, grunts. Also, everyone shared same unhappy feeling, sadness, but everyone has different limitations. So I cannot see myself complaining 24/7, criticizing my government too much in social media, without acknowledging that they also did a lot. Of course, I am sympathy to the 60,000 victims who died. Perhaps better policy could, revive them, but I don't think so. There is so much to do, but so little time. So I can only, give my sympathy to the victims. But I can also lend my sympathy, a copious of it, to efforts which have made so far by my government, by other foreign governments who, sent support to my country. So I think that's that way, as a conscious scholar during pandemic, I think that is the most important, because otherwise I cannot be, I have to pay attention to my well-being as well, right? As a student, as a mom, as a daughter of my mom, as friend to my colleagues, as a student of my 2 supervisors who really, Katrina Leku and Professor Jackie True. If next time you hear this podcast, this is dedicated to you, because you've been very supportive to my study during PhD. And without your, understanding, I don't know if I can reach the stage.
Irene, just listening to you, I don't know, I'm not sure if I can put this into words accurately, but just a roller coaster of different emotions just listening from you. And your experiences really resonate with me. And I really admire how you clearly articulated your positionalities, as a student, as a mother, as an Indonesian, as a scholar, within this context of the pandemic. And I'm sure that the experience that you shared with us will be uh, will speak to a lot of people who share the same experiences and who are also in maybe in one way or another in the same positionalities as you've mentioned. And I really admire you for also telling us all these initiatives on how we take care of ourselves, how we understand the many issues related to this pandemic. But it seems to me that what contribute to you overcoming these challenges are more of personal initiatives. Correct me if I'm wrong. But I'm also curious. You've mentioned about how Katrina Liku and Jackie True, as your supervisors, really are supportive to you as their student. But I'm wondering, if we look at the broader structure of the academia, what can academic institutions do better or do more to help international students overcome these challenges that you've mentioned?
Yeah, that's a good question, actually, because we are still part of a bigger structural system. And academic in Australia is actually, yesterday I read news, La Trobe cut some of the teachers, right? Monash University also cut some of the source from the university, meaning there is also problems in terms of the finance or the capacity of the federal government, perhaps with regard to budget at the universities. So that being said, I really appreciate that systemically, our center, GPS Monash, has established a system where colleagues, us PhD students, could communicate regularly in a what we call as PhD GPS meetup session. The second is at the faculty level, at the university level, there is this policy, for instance, extended milestones for PhD students. So I think it's for them who reach second year or almost finish with her or his thesis. So you can extend, I think, 1 to 3 times. But of course, you need to pay attention for the scholarship condition. So in terms of support, my university and my faculty give like 100% support for me to finish. Or even if I want to like have a study leave for a while, totally my option is open. But I understand there is particular limitation with regard to the scholarship if you're going home and the migration policy. I think that is the toughest one. And I think not only me experience it, but many hundred students, international, especially from uh, Western Europe, perhaps Scandinavian countries, European Union, several other countries with very strict border migration policy definitely will affect how international students live and study. My stake is not only me, but it's my son as well, and he's under 12. So the level of responsibility as PhD student for me is not only affect me, but also my son. That is being said, I cannot be selfish, only deciding everything from my interest as well. So in this respect, it is very helpful that you talk with supervisor. This is particularly for PhD student. You talk with your supervisor and very frank about it. What do you want to get in any kind of supervisory meeting? To what extent you want supervisor to give you direction? For instance, because I also understand they are busy. So I have to make myself clear that in any supervisory session, I already set targets. So I can see myself progressing from one aspect, from one level to another. So this is kind of luxury that perhaps my colleague PhD students in Indonesia are not having at the moment, because they are doubling, the risks are double than what I face here in Australia. And I always remember that. I want to really make progress. I already sent my supervisor 4 chapters, for instance. That actually quite achievement for me, because meaning I can progress. But I also realize maybe others not so lucky, because their perspective in pandemic is different. If my other colleague from other universities show some solidarity with what happened in Indonesia, that is really, I appreciate it very much, because that come from persons who really understand what is the meaning of neighbor. Australia and Indonesia were just neighbor. That is really touching, I think.
Yeah, it's quite impressive, really. I think it takes a level of wisdom to have that combination of, recognizing your privileges and at the same time sympathizing and being in solidarity with those who don't experience those privileges, and at the same time as a PhD student progressing on your research. So this is quite an impressive feat, Irene. And I know that, as you've mentioned already, this pandemic is really taking a toll on our research progress for international students, especially. And I know you are still continuing on your research, and congratulations on completing 4 chapters. That's really, really
Four
impressive.
and a half, 4.5, almost 5.
Oh, great. See, it's almost 5 already.
Oh my
But
God.
yeah, so you are still, I think, on the process of writing, and it's great that your data collection, despite the pandemic, is still progressing. So what are the next steps in your research project? Again, as you've mentioned,
Yeah.
we have to recognize our
Yes.
privileges
Thank
and
you.
considering the difficulties brought by this pandemic.
This is a bit heartbreaking for me as well. I mentioned earlier that my field work is delayed because of the pandemic, right? But my interview uh, method is actually help pretty much with Zoom system. Now I have to also pay attention to well-being of my participants, research participants, because this is a very stressful condition for all of us in Indonesia. So I don't find it ethical for them to have interview this year. Maybe I can try, but I myself, like, they need their life to attend to firstly. I haven't got a time to put myself still into a journal article because it takes longer, I know. So far I only produce mostly blogs or short essays, other than other jobs, public engagement, pretty much 2 or 3 webinars I will still attend per month. But that, I think, my next journey is still writing my other chapters. Other than that, I also still follow closely about the realities on the ground, right? How the counterterrorism and the prevention of violent extremism taking place. Because you see, even during pandemic, the terrorists still there. Yeah, we had 3 or 4 cases since 2020 in Indonesia that involve young women, and that is so unfortunate. And also, the United Nations Security Council recently released, it was January 2021, and still put ISIS, including those affiliated in Southeast Asia, as active groups, meaning policy-wise, there is still room for me to observe as part of the academic discussion, discourses about terrorism threat and how women agency in terms of preventing it, or how we see women as part of the antagonist actor in terms of terror itself.
Irene, I learned a lot from your story, from your experiences, and your insights really on, as I've mentioned a while ago, the articulating all these positionalities that you have, of which I also share, and I'm sure many of our audience also share with. And you mentioned about, the sense of community, how important it is during this pandemic to have the sense of community, being a member of that community, giving to that community, and also maybe obtaining some strength knowing that there's a community for you. And I would say that I also benefited from that community. I reach out to you and thank you so much for obliging us with this interview. And I learned a lot about solidarity, about the importance of communicating um, uh, our experiences with others. And I also think this is very important for me as well. You've mentioned about healthy grievance. I think maybe that's something really is important for us during this pandemic, is to have that space to grieve, right? Because only that is the healthy way for us to move forward, is to share freely our sense of loss and our feelings of grief. So thank you for reminding me of that. Thank you for reminding me also that it's important to recognize my privileges and to be always sympathetic with others and be in solidarity with those communities who are experiencing these difficulties. Before I end this podcast, Irene, I would like to lend the last words for this episode to you. If you have final remarks or any message that you wish to share with our audience, especially to international students, that would be great.
But there is this character of the Albert Camus, The Plague. His name is Raymond Rambert, and he said, "I know it's an absurd situation, but we're all involved in it, and we've got to accept it as it is." So I think that is a matter of acceptance, but also calculated acceptance, I think, because it's going back to you, how you're going to respond and how you're going to shape your actions out of it as it is. We are involved in it. So it's really conscious. Whenever you think you are weak, you can just stop and just take a break, take a long, hard, sleep or have a nap. Just don't make a burden out of yourself as part of international student, because being far from family is tough. My supervisor also sent me a text yesterday. Well, this is a very hard time for you and your family, so you need to take time. Don't think about your thesis. I said, yeah, thank you so much. I think that is my message to my fellow international students. Take your time. Like you mentioned, take time to grieve. That is completely true. This is very unusual circumstance. It is what it is. But yeah, take some time to grieve.
Thank you for listening to this episode. Please consider leaving a comment or rating at iTunes or any of your preferred podcast hosting platforms. For details about upcoming episodes and how to support the Scholars Unbound project, visit daliasimangon.com/scholars unbound with the link in our show notes.